On November 9, 1923, a failed artist and war veteran stood in a Munich beer hall, pointing a pistol at government officials, declaring himself the new leader of Germany. Within hours, he was fleeing through the streets like a common criminal. 10 years later, that same man would be handed the keys to one of Europe's most powerful nations. Legally, this is the story of how Adolf Hitler transformed from a jailed extremist into the Chancellor of Germany, a rise so improbable, so calculated, and so devastating that it would reshape the world forever. But here's what will shock you. Hitler didn't seize power through violence or revolution. He was invited in by politicians who thought they could control him, by a democratic system that handed him everything he needed to destroy it from within. How does a man with no political experience, no wealthy backers, and a criminal record convince an entire nation to follow him? How does a movement that seemed dead and buried in 1923 become unstoppable by 1933? The answer lies in 10 crucial years of German history, 10 years of economic chaos, political paralysis, and one man's ruthless understanding of human psychology. This is not just the story of Hitler's rise. It's a masterclass in how democracy dies. One compromise at a time, our story begins in the darkness of a prison cell, where the most dangerous book of the 20th century was about to be written. While most prisoners count days until freedom, Adolf Hitler was counting pages. 924 pages of a manifesto that would one day justify the murder of 6 million Jews. Pause April 1924. Landsberg Prison, Bavaria. The man who had stormed out of the Munich beer hall in handcuffs was now prisoner number 45. But here's the twisted irony. This prison sentence would become the foundation of his political empire. The trial itself had been Hitler's first masterpiece of manipulation. Instead of defending his actions, he transformed the courtroom into a stage. For 24 days, he didn't speak as a defendant. He performed as a prophet. "I alone bear the responsibility," he declared to the judges. "But I am no criminal because of that. If today I stand here as a revolutionary, it is as a revolutionary against the revolution." The crowd erupted. The judges, supposed to be impartial, were visibly moved. What should have been political suicide became political resurrection. German newspapers, instead of condemning him, began calling him a patriotic hero. His trial wasn't destroying his movement. It was advertising it to the entire nation, but it was inside Landsberg prison where the real danger began. Hitler wasn't just serving time, he was using it. A 5-year minimum sentence became just 13 months of luxury. A private room, unlimited visitors, and something more precious than freedom, uninterrupted time to think. This is where Mein Kampf was born. Not in some underground bunker, but in a comfortable prison cell with a view of the Bavarian countryside. Rudolf Hess, his devoted follower, took dictation as Hitler paced back and forth. Unleashing his twisted vision onto paper, page by page, Hitler laid out his blueprint: the superiority of the Aryan race, the Jewish conspiracy, the need for living space in Eastern Europe, the destiny of Germany to rule the world. It wasn't just autobiography. It was a manual for genocide, written in plain sight. But here's what's truly terrifying. When Mein Kampf was published in 1925, it wasn't banned or hidden. It was sold in bookstores across Germany. Critics dismissed it as the ravings of a failed revolutionary. They couldn't have been more wrong. By the time Hitler walked out of Landsberg prison, December 20th, 1924, he had served less than 13 months. The man who entered was a failed putsch leader. The man who emerged had a plan, a book, and most dangerously of all, time to execute both. But as Hitler plotted his return, Germany itself was changing. The chaos that had made his revolution possible was disappearing. Prosperity was returning. Democracy was stabilizing. And his Nazi party was crumbling without him. Had he missed his moment forever? By 1928, Hitler's Nazi party had become so irrelevant, they won just 2.6% of the vote. Less support than a fringe party gets on social media today. Welcome to the golden age of the Weimar Republic. American dollars were flowing into Germany through the Dawes Plan. Factories were humming. Nightclubs were booming. Democracy seemed to be working. Berlin had become the cultural capital of Europe. a playground of art, science, and progressive politics. While Germany danced, Hitler fumed. Released from prison, he found his movement in ruins. The Nazi Party was banned. His followers had scattered, and worst of all, nobody seemed to care about his message anymore. Why would they? Germans had jobs. They had food. They had hope. But here's what the celebrating Germans didn't see. Their prosperity was built on quicksand. Every factory, every paycheck, every moment of stability depended on one thing: American loans. And in the back rooms of Munich, a patient predator was rebuilding his hunting pack. February 27, 1925. Hitler stood before 4,000 supporters in the same Munich beer hall where his putsch had failed. But this time, his message was different. No more armed revolution. No more illegal coups. We will take power legally, he declared. We will use democracy to destroy democracy. What followed was 5 years of methodical preparation. Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party like a shadow government. It had its own departments, its own army, the SA, its own propaganda machine. Joseph Goebbels joined in 1926, bringing with him the dark arts of mass psychology. They rehearsed their rallies like theater productions. Every gesture, every chant, every lighting effect was calculated for maximum emotional impact. Hitler practiced his speeches in front of mirrors, perfecting the hypnotic rhythm that would one day entrance millions. But all this preparation seemed pointless. In the 1928 elections, the Nazis won just 12 seats out of 491 in the Reichstag. Social Democrats and moderates dominated. Democracy was winning. Hitler's radical message was falling on deaf ears, yet beneath Germany's golden surface, cracks were forming. Farmers were drowning in debt. The middle class feared communism. And most dangerously of all, the entire economic miracle was a house of cards, built on borrowed American money. Hitler sensed this instability like a predator smells blood. While other politicians celebrated Germany's recovery, he was preparing for its collapse. He knew something they didn't. Prosperity built on borrowed money never lasts. In Berlin's cafes, intellectuals debated art and philosophy. In the nightclubs, people danced until dawn. In the halls of government, politicians congratulated themselves on saving democracy. But across the Atlantic, storm clouds were gathering. Storm clouds that would soon turn Hitler from a forgotten extremist into the most dangerous man in Europe. October 1929 was just months away, and with it would come the event that handed Adolf Hitler the keys to power, the collapse of the American stock market, and with it, the collapse of German prosperity. In just 18 months, unemployment in Germany exploded, from 1.3 million to over 6 million, and with each jobless worker, Hitler gained a potential voter, someone with nothing left to lose. October 24, 1929, Black Thursday. Wall Street collapsed. As American stock prices crashed, something else crashed with them. Germany's so-called economic miracle. American investors, desperate for cash, began yanking their money out of German banks, faster than water draining from a broken dam. What followed was devastation on an unimaginable scale. Factories shut down overnight. Banks collapsed. Middle-class families, who had rebuilt their lives after the war, watched their savings vanish. But here's the cruel twist. While millions of Germans faced ruin, one man celebrated in his Munich apartment. Hitler had been waiting 5 years for this moment. He knew that desperate people don't vote for moderation. They vote for radical promises. By 1930, the streets of Germany told the story of a nation in collapse. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Former businessmen sold apples on street corners. Families were evicted from their homes. Their furniture piled on sidewalks like broken dreams. And in this misery, Hitler found his golden opportunity. His message suddenly made sense to people who had lost everything. The system has failed you. The politicians have betrayed you. Only we can save you. Hitler didn't just promise solutions. He gave Germans someone to blame. The Treaty of Versailles. The bankers. The communists. The Jews. For people drowning in desperation, these simple explanations felt like lifeboats, even if they carried them into darker waters. September 14, 1930. Election Day. As Germans cast their ballots, Hitler waited nervously at Nazi headquarters. The results would shock the world and terrify Germany's democratic leaders. The Nazi Party exploded from 12 seats to 107 in the Reichstag, from 2.6% to 18.3% in just 2 years. That night, Nazi supporters filled the streets of Munich with celebration. The extremist party of Adolf Hitler has become a major force in German politics. But the most terrifying part wasn't the Nazi victory. It was how quickly normal Germans had embraced the message. Teachers, shopkeepers, farmers, students, the very people who had ignored Hitler during the good times, now saw him as their savior. In the halls of power, democratic politicians finally began to take Hitler seriously, but they made a fatal mistake. They believed they could control him, use him, then discard him. By the end of 1930, Hitler was no longer a fringe extremist. He was a political force that could not be ignored, and his greatest weapon wasn't his ideology. It wasn't even his promises. It was his propaganda machine. The Great Depression had given him the opening. Now he only needed to turn that opportunity into unstoppable momentum. And for that, he would unleash the most sophisticated manipulation campaign the world had ever seen. By 1932, the Nazi Party was staging 3,000 rallies per month across Germany, turning politics into theater and citizens into an audience hungry for their next performance. Basic. Joseph Goebbels had turned manipulation into an art form. Every Nazi poster, every speech, every march, designed with surgical precision to trigger emotional responses. They didn't just want votes. They wanted souls. Emphasize, Hitler was the first politician to truly understand the power of modern technology. While his opponents gave boring speeches to small crowds, Hitler hired airplanes, flying to multiple cities in a single day. His campaign slogan said it all. Hitler über Deutschland. Hitler over Germany. Literally and figuratively. Pause. But here's what made Hitler's propaganda so dangerous. It wasn't just lies. It was carefully crafted half-truths that tapped into real German anxieties. Yes, unemployment was crushing. Yes, the government seemed helpless. Yes, Germany had been humiliated after World War I. While Goebbels conquered minds, the SA Hitler's brown-shirted stormtroopers conquered the streets. By 1932, they numbered over 400,000 men, not just political supporters, but a private army. A force that made the Nazi presence impossible to ignore. Every Nazi rally was designed to provoke confrontation. The SA would march through communist neighborhoods, deliberately starting fights. When violence erupted, Nazi newspapers would scream, "See? Germany is in chaos. Only we can restore order." Dramatic pause. The Nazis had turned political violence into a recruitment tool. Young men, unemployed and angry, were drawn to the SA, not just for ideology, but for belonging, purpose, and power. They gave desperate men uniforms, unity, enemies to fight. Hitler's speeches were psychological weapons. He would start quietly, building tension, then explode into passionate fury, speaking directly to each listener's fears and hopes. Witnesses described feeling hypnotized, swept away by the sheer emotional force. But perhaps Hitler's most dangerous innovation was the big lie. Small lies could be challenged. Massive lies seemed too outrageous to be false. The Jews caused Germany's defeat in World War I. Marxists are destroying German culture. The bigger the lie, the more people believed it. Solely, meanwhile, Germany's democratic parties were paralyzed. Social Democrats fought with communists. Conservatives plotted against liberals. While they squabbled over procedure, Hitler was building a movement that transcended politics. By 1932, Nazi rallies had become cultural events. Families attended like they were going to festivals. Children collected Nazi memorabilia. The swastika wasn't just a political symbol. It was becoming part of German identity. President Hindenburg's government was collapsing. Chancellor after chancellor fell. A system that had seemed stable just 3 years earlier was now lurching from crisis to crisis. And with each failure, more Germans turned to the one man who promised simple solutions to complex problems. As 1932 dawned, Hitler had transformed himself from fringe agitator into the leader of Germany's largest political movement. But winning the streets wasn't enough. He needed to win power legally, and that would require the greatest gamble of his career. The year 1932 would see 5 major elections in Germany, 5 chances for Hitler to prove he wasn't just a protest movement, but the future of the nation. 5 opportunities to turn street power into governmental power. The question was, would German democracy survive the test? In 1932, Germans voted in more elections than any other year in their democratic history, and with each ballot they cast, they brought Adolf Hitler one step closer to absolute power. March 1932. Presidential election, round 1. Hitler challenged the 84-year-old war hero President Hindenburg directly. The results stunned Germany. Hindenburg 49.6%, Hitler 31%, no majority. A runoff was required. April 1932, presidential election, round 2. Hitler's campaign was relentless. He flew to 21 cities in 6 days, addressing over 1 million people. His message was simple: give me power, and I will make Germany great again. Hindenburg won with 53%. But Hitler's 37% proved he was now a national force. Paul's July 33 Reichstag elections. When the votes were counted, the impossible had happened. The Nazi Party won 230 seats out of 608. They were now the largest party in the German parliament. Hitler had gone from prisoner to leader of Germany's biggest political movement in just 9 years. But here's the cruel irony. Winning the most seats didn't mean winning power. Germany's constitution required a majority to form a government. The Nazis had only 37.3% of the vote. The other parties, despite hating each other, united in one thing: keeping Hitler out of power. President Hindenburg despised Hitler, calling him that Austrian corporal. He refused to appoint him chancellor, despite the Nazi victory. Instead, he appointed Franz von Papen, a conservative politician representing the old elite. But Papen's government was doomed from the start. The Nazis and communists together controlled over half the Reichstag. They couldn't agree on anything, except destroying the democratic system. Every proposal failed. Germany became ungovernable. November 6, 1932, another Reichstag election. This time something unexpected happened. The Nazi vote dropped to 33.1%. They lost 34 seats. For the first time since 1930, Hitler's momentum seemed to be stopping. Democratic politicians celebrated. The Nazi tide has turned, they declared. Some even believed Hitler was finished. His party was running out of money. Supporters were exhausted by constant campaigning. But Germany's conservative politicians made a devastating mistake. They thought they could use Hitler's popularity while controlling his radical agenda. Kurt von Schleicher became chancellor in December 1932. But he too failed. And in the shadows, a dangerous conspiracy was forming. Franz von Papen began secret negotiations with Hitler. His plan was breathtakingly arrogant. Make Hitler chancellor, but keep him under control. By the end of 1932, Germany had burned through 3 chancellors in 8 months. The democratic system was paralyzed. The economy was still in crisis. Street violence was rising. Something had to give. January 4th, 1933. Papen and Hitler met secretly at a banker's house in Cologne. What they discussed would change the course of history. Papen believed he was making a deal with the devil. He could control. He couldn't have been more wrong. As January 1933 began, Hitler was closer to power than ever before. The conservatives thought they held all the cards. The Democrats thought the Nazi threat was fading. But in the backrooms of Berlin, the final betrayal of German democracy was being negotiated. January 30th, 1933, was just weeks away. And on that date, the old men who thought they could control Adolf Hitler would hand him the keys to destroy everything they claimed to protect. At 11:15 a.m. on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler walked into President Hindenburg's office as a political outsider. Wasn't 15 minutes later, he walked out as the most powerful man in Germany, emphasized legally appointed by the very system he had sworn to destroy. The meeting that doomed democracy lasted just a quarter of an hour. President Hindenburg, the 85-year-old war hero who once called Hitler that Austrian corporal, now shook hands with him and spoke the words that would haunt history. "I hereby appoint you Chancellor of Germany." Slowly, Franz von Papen stood beside them, smiling with satisfaction. His plan seemed perfect. Hitler as Chancellor, but surrounded by conservative ministers, only 3 Nazis in the entire cabinet. "We have hired Hitler," Papen boasted to his friends. "In 2 months, we will have pushed him so far into the corner that he will squeak." But here's what Papen didn't understand. Hitler had spent 9 years studying how to destroy democracy from within. He didn't need every ministry. He only needed the right ones, and he had secured the 2 that mattered most: the Interior Ministry and the Prussian Ministry of Interior, giving him command over the police. Pause. That evening, as news spread across Berlin, Nazi celebrations began. Thousands of stormtroopers marched through the Brandenburg Gate, carrying torches. Their boots thundered on cobblestones. In perfect synchronization, the parade lasted for hours, a river of flame flowing through the heart of the German capital. From his window in the presidential palace, old Hindenburg watched the torchlight procession with tears in his eyes. "My dear Papen," he said softly, "I hope to God we have not made a terrible mistake." Those words would prove to be among the most prophetic in history. Within hours, Hitler was already consolidating power. He called for new elections in March, knowing he could now use the resources of the state to campaign. "Give me 4 years, he promised the German people, "and you will not recognize Germany." The Social Democrats and other parties still believed they could stop him through elections, but they failed to see the rules of the game had changed. Hitler wasn't just another politician. He was a revolutionary with legal access to power. Within days, it became clear who was really in control. When conservative ministers tried to restrain Hitler's radical proposals, he ignored them. When they threatened to resign, he welcomed it. The supposed guardians of democracy discovered they had no power to guard anything. February 1933 became a month of escalating intimidation. Nazi stormtroopers were given auxiliary police powers. Opposition meetings were banned for public safety. Newspapers critical of the government were shut down. Each day brought new restrictions, each one justified as a temporary measure to restore order. By mid-February, Hitler had transformed from a constitutional chancellor into something far more dangerous. The conservatives watched in horror as their creation turned against them. But it was too late. The monster was out of the cage. As February turned to March, one question haunted every German who still believed in democracy. Could the upcoming elections stop Hitler's consolidation of power? Or had January 30th been the day democracy signed its own death warrant? The March elections were approaching rapidly, but Hitler had no intention of leaving his fate to the voters. He was about to prove that once a dictator gains legal power, elections become meaningless theater. The final act of the Weimar Republic was about to begin. What happened next would show the world that democracy's greatest weakness is not external attack, but internal betrayal, and Hitler, now legally in power, was about to reveal how quickly freedom can be dismantled by those sworn to protect it. In just 53 days, from January 30 to March 21st, 1933, Adolf Hitler transformed Germany from a democracy into a dictatorship, so completely that historians still struggle to comprehend the speed of its collapse. February 27th, 1933, 9:14 p.m., the German Parliament building, the Reichstag, burst into flames. A lone Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was caught at the scene. Hitler arrived within minutes, his eyes gleaming with opportunity, not shock. "This is a God-given signal," he declared. Whether Hitler orchestrated the fire or simply exploited it remains debated. But his response was swift and devastating. Within hours, he convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Decree for the Protection of People and State. It suspended all civil liberties indefinitely. That single decree destroyed the German Constitution without changing a word of it. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble or privacy, all vanished. Overnight, March 5th, 1933, the elections Hitler had promised would be free and fair. became Germany's last democratic vote for 12 years. But they weren't free. They were held under a state of emergency. Opposition leaders sat in jail. Nazi stormtroopers maintained order at polling stations. Even with massive intimidation, the Nazis won only 43.9% of the vote. Still, not a majority, but Hitler had learned to work within the system, to destroy it. He formed a coalition with the conservative German National People's Party. Together, they gave him the majority he needed. March 23, 1933, the Kroll Opera House in Berlin. Parliament gathered in this ornate venue. For what would be democracy's funeral, Hitler proposed the Enabling Act. It gave his government the power to pass laws. Without parliamentary approval, Social Democratic leader Otto Wels stood to speak, knowing it might cost him his life. Freedom and life can be taken from us, but not honor, he declared. It was democracy's final defiant voice. The vote, 444 in favor, 94 against. Only the Social Democrats voted no. The Communists were already in jail, or in hiding. The German parliament had just voted itself out of existence, handing Hitler the legal authority to rule by decree. What followed was breathtaking in its systematic brutality. April, Jewish civil servants were fired. May, trade unions were abolished. June, the Social Democratic Party was banned. July, all political parties except the Nazis were outlawed. The conservatives, who thought they could control Hitler, watched in horror, their own institutions dismantled before their eyes. By the summer of 1933, Hitler had achieved something unprecedented: the complete legal transformation of a democracy into a dictatorship. No revolution, no coup, no foreign invasion, just the systematic abuse of democratic procedures to destroy democracy itself. August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer. The prisoner had become the dictator. The failed coup leader had become the absolute ruler. But the true horror was only beginning, because Hitler's rise to power was not an end. It was the beginning of something far more terrible. The man who walked out of Landsberg prison in 1924 with a criminal record and a banned political party had in just 9 years legally seized control of one of the world's most advanced democracies, and he did it by following the rules until he had the power to break them all. This is the most chilling lesson of Hitler's rise. He didn't destroy German democracy through revolution or invasion. He destroyed it through exploitation, using its freedoms to eliminate freedom, its tolerance to install intolerance, its legal system to create an illegal state. Every step of Hitler's rise was visible. Every technique he used was documented. Every warning sign was present, yet at each crucial moment, those with the power to stop him either underestimated his danger, overestimated their control, or simply believed it could never happen to them. What began as political ambition in a Munich beer hall would end with 50 million dead in World War II, 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, and an entire continent in ruins. The prisoner who wrote his manifesto in a comfortable cell had authored the blueprint for humanity's darkest chapter. Franz von Papen, who boasted he had hired Hitler, lived to see his country destroyed, and divided the conservative politicians who thought they could control the radical, discovered too late that extremists don't honor gentlemen's agreements. They exploit them. The democratic parties that spent more time fighting each other than fighting Hitler learned the fatal lesson. When democracy faces an existential threat, internal divisions become suicidal weaknesses. Unity in the face of extremism isn't optional. It's survival. Joseph Goebbels' techniques, the big lie, emotional manipulation, the transformation of politics into theater, didn't die with Nazi Germany. They became the template for authoritarian movements worldwide, proving that Hitler's most dangerous legacy wasn't his ideology, but his methods. How could one of the world's most educated, cultured nations follow a failed artist into madness? How could intelligent people convince themselves they could control a man who had publicly stated his intention to destroy them? How could democracy legally vote itself out of existence? Hitler's rise teaches us that democracy is not self-preserving. It requires constant vigilance, active protection, and the courage to confront extremism before it gains power. The price of freedom is not just eternal vigilance, it's the willingness to act on that vigilance when it matters most. In 1933, as Hitler consolidated his dictatorship, a German pastor named Martin Niemöller wrote words that echo across history. First they came for the communists, then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Adolf Hitler's rise from prisoner to dictator remains history's most terrifying reminder that democracy's greatest enemy is not external invasion, but internal complacency. The question is not whether it could happen again, but whether we have learned enough from history to recognize the warning signs and find the courage to act before it's too late. The story of Hitler's rise is not just German history. It's human history, and it's a story every generation must remember, understand, and guard against, because the price of forgetting is not just the loss of democracy, it's the loss of everything democracy protects.